June is the traditional campaign season in Russia. Don't forget that Germany in World War II had invaded Russia in the month of June 1941. This is the time when the spring rains finish, the mud and slush dies out, and the ground hardens adequately to permit the tanks to move cross country, leave the roads and move across the open Russian steppes. So it was widely expected that in the month of June, the Russians would finally launch their major offensive, their coup de grace, to finish the war in Ukraine once and for all. It was quite clear that Russia had worked very methodically to gain an advantage in industrial and manpower mobilization. Their wartime economy had adjusted very well. They were producing 3 million artillery shells every year compared to the 1 million total production of NATO and the United States. They were also in a very rapid pace recouping the expenditure of their rockets and missiles, surface-to-air weapons, and their Grad Katyusha series of multi-barrel rocket launchers, etc. Russia clearly had the edge in manpower. They had made the initial mistake of going in for invasion light with just 150,000 men, which had proved totally inadequate. Russia was even then hoping for an early ceasefire and cessation of hostilities. Putin was very keen to keep it a limited operation. That is why he had called it a special operation. He had hoped that after he had made the initial gains, he had captured more or less the whole provinces of Luhansk and Donetsk. He had secured a land bridge to Crimea, secured the Ukrainian coastline, secured all the ports, less Odessa. He had gained what he had to. And he was therefore very keen to call it quits in the month of April 2022. That is why the talks were held in Belarusia, that is why the talks were held in Istanbul, and a Istanbul communique had been worked out which would have ended the war. But the NATO and the Americans were very keen to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian. They couldn't give a damn for how many casualties Ukraine suffered, but they egged it on to continue with the fight to spurn the peace talks, the peace dialogue, and the agreement that had been reached was thrown into the waste paper basket, and Zelensky was encouraged to carry on with the fighting to cause as much casualties and damage to Russian Federation as possible. The fact of the matter is, even now, Ukraine, when it is down and out, when it has suffered over 500,000 casualties, killed and wounded, and it is at the end of its manpower barrel. It's scraping the barrel to pull out teenagers from the streets, old men from the streets, and just press gang and send them to the front to just die. There is a serious moral problem in Ukraine, and the fact of the matter is that the Russians were expected to now therefore deliver the coup de grace. Quite obviously, this had spelt alarm in the Western capitals, especially amongst the NATO countries, especially France was extremely worried. They were very upset that the Wagner group had driven them out of all their so-called African colonies and where they had a francophone Africa. They were seething with rage, suppressed rage, and they threatened to put boots on the ground. Initially it was thought that it would be east of the Dnieper, but then they said they would like to put boots on the ground even beyond. And their brigade of the Legion, the Foreign Legion, there was much talk of the French Foreign Legion sending in its 3rd Brigade. The only point was this brigade was deployed in Africa. Most of it was bluff and bluster. But then, the Russians took it seriously and they commenced attacks in Lviv and other places on the NATO personnel. They knew where they were, where the American personnel were, and in the attack on Lviv, they killed about 300 NATO and American advisors and support personnel. Everybody knows that the Americans have put in their civilian contractors on the ground. They are the people operating in civil clothes. They are operating the ATACMS, the Patriot missile batteries, the HIMARS, etc. All the data that comes in from American satellites is fed into these. The target coordinates are fed into these by the Americans. The French have sent their people for their Scalp cruise missiles. The British have sent their own engineers for the Storm Shadow missiles. The entire programming is being done by NATO and American personnel. And these are now causing damage in Russia proper and in Crimea especially. So Russians were also incensed and they decided to hit back, pay back in the same coin. They struck the Lviv facility and other centers where there were known concentration of American and NATO personnel who were operating these more sophisticated weapons. When 300 casualties were inflicted, that sort of crossed United States and NATO red line, in the sense that they were now losing their personnel and in major ways. So there was a lot of angst on both sides, and the NATO countries, especially France, Poland, threatened to put boots on the ground. That was the only way to save Ukraine. Given its manpower deficit, given its deficit in heavy artillery ammunition, the only way to save Ukraine was for the NATO to put boots on the ground. Now that very clearly was a major red line, and if the NATO or American soldiers had come in and put boots on the ground, it could easily have escalated to the tactical nuclear level. The world was expecting, as I said, the Russian major counter-offensive, and this major counter-offensive finally came in the month of May. But this was not the main operation that was anticipated, either towards Kupiansk or towards Kyiv, Odessa, or even Kharkiv. What happened was a diversionary offensive with about a corps-sized force, about 30,000 troops, which had been massed opposite Kharkiv sector, and they, the 72nd Motor Rifle Division, newly formed, was used very effectively. The Russians had carefully studied the lessons of this war, the experience of this war. They had factored in the very heavy lethality of the drones, which were especially lethal against tanks and armored personnel carriers and these category of larger offensive vehicles. The Russians had therefore innovated in a very significant manner. They had learnt on the job, and their new answer to this was the answer that had come towards the end of World War I, when the Germans had begun to use very well-trained stormtroopers, smaller detachments of small troopers, to try and effect breakthroughs in that stalemate on the Western Front. So this time the Russians had now innovated and brought in their Fab glide toss bombs. These were fitted with wings and with strap-on inertial navigation guidance kits of the GLONASS satellite series that the Russians have aloft in space, which could not be jammed, which could not be spoofed, because all guidance systems based on the GPS can be badly spoofed or shut off by the Americans. So they use their own GLONASS guidance system strapped on to these glide toss bombs, and these glide toss bombs were then used in a very effective way to cause colossal casualties. 500 kilogram bombs, 1000 kilogram bombs, 2000, and now even 3000 kilogram heavy ordnance, which was the old dumb bombs which were then transformed into the glide toss bombs. These had a major devastating effect, and they helped the Russians win the Battle of Avdiivka. This was of course coupled up with heavy artillery fire support from the Russians. They have a 5:1 advantage in artillery vis-a-vis the Ukrainians, and their armament factories are just churning out medium artillery shells. Like I said, 3 millions per year annually, which is about 3 times what the Americans and the NATO combined could produce. There was also the impact of the delayed delayed American arms package to Ukraine, which in itself caused severe problems to Ukraine, and the Russians fully exploited that. So they launched this deception or Maskarovka offensive in the Kharkiv direction in the month of May. They made rapid and surprising progress. They have been using fast attack vehicles, dune buggies and motorcycles. Once again, don't forget that in the Second World War, the Germans had used motorcycles with sidecars in a very major way to operate in the flat steppes of Russia, and the same because the heavier armored vehicles are under serious threat from drones, and even the Ukrainians are mass producing drones to carry out strikes against the Russian armored personnel carriers, their tanks, etc. So they innovated, and they used their stormtroopers, smaller squads of about 6 to 8, which were mounted either on the fast attack vehicles or on dune buggies or on motorcycles. And these have been launching very effective assaults against the Ukrainians. They made rapid progress, captured some 12 villages, and then major fighting is now taking place for the capture of Lysychansk and Vovchansk. And in both, the Russians are making steady progress. It was anticipated that this would pull out Ukrainian formations from the east, and that is precisely what happened. The Ukrainians have pulled out about 5 brigades from the south and the southern and the eastern sectors. 3 marine brigades have been pulled out of Kherson and redeployed in the Kharkiv sector. The Ukrainians seem to be clearly alarmed by this threat to the Kharkiv, the second largest city in Ukraine, and they have stabilized their defenses now, and they have started launching a series of counterattacks. The Russians once again have used their air power advantage, their artillery advantage to decimate, to inflict serious casualties upon these Ukrainian formations which have been brought in from the rear depth areas, and they are trying to catch them in their movement phase. As they move forward either on rail or on road axes, they are trying to engage them with their drones, with their air power, with their FAB, etc., FAB glide toss bombs. They have been trying to inflict heavy casualties, and they have learned their lesson that major tank pushes are now a thing of history as long as no counter is found to the drones. So they have been focusing on creeping advances both in the north. Now they have resumed the pressure in the east, and in the sector of Avdiivka, Kupiansk, also south of it in the Donetsk and Luhansk sector, the Russians have started their creeping advances, paving the way with their glide toss bombs to inflict heavy damage on the Ukrainians. They have been using their 3,000 kilogram glide toss bombs to very serious effect, because this has a benumbing impact. The delivery of so many kilograms, so many tons of explosive onto a defending target benumbs the people. They have a glazed and comatose look after they have survived that kind of artillery pounding and bombardment. Destruction shoots, not just neutralization shoots. These pave the way for infantry assault by special stormtrooper detachments, which the Russians have been using with great effect. The key question is, what about the Russian main counter-offensive that was expected to go in either towards Kyiv or towards Kharkiv, which has already started, or also towards Odessa? These were the three projected targets of the main Russian counter-offensive, for which they have about 300,000 troops ready and waiting. I think Putin has been extremely cautious. He wants to avoid mass casualties to the Russians. Major offensives cost very heavy casualties, as we had seen last year in the failed Ukrainian counter-offensives. They had been decimated, destroyed, very heavy casualties had been inflicted. So the Russians were keen to avoid getting into the same trap themselves, and that is why the Russian hesitation and caution in launching the main offensive. The second fact is the threat, the very serious threat being posed by the NATO and the United States, that if they are seen as clearly losing face globally, but they are desperate enough to try and threaten or very seriously consider putting boots on the ground, which was a strict no from the very beginning of this war. At least if the United States won't put its troops on the ground, the NATO, especially France and Poland, were very definitely threatening to intervene and to escalate this conflict, not just vertically in terms of tactical nuclear weapons, but also horizontally. So Putin has been extremely cautious, extremely rational. He is not rushing into a major Third World War style conflagration, however much the NATO are egging him on, pushing him into doing something very, very major and very catastrophic. This brinkmanship is extremely dangerous. It can easily backfire, because let me be candid, the NATO and the United States are not in a position to fight a major prolonged conflict in Europe. As of now, their industrial mobilization is just not up to fighting a major conflict. They are hoping that the very entry of their troops on the ground would make that thin red line, which would deter Russia, from attacking them. Now, this thin red line the Russians crossed straight away in Lviv by actually attacking and killing the NATO forces and giving a clear warning that if NATO forces put their boots on the ground in Ukraine, they would be very fair game. We all know the fact that NATO, especially Germany and France, Great Britain, and now the United States under Biden, have given a green light to the Ukrainians to use their long-range HIMARS, ATACMS, and their cruise missiles gifted by the British and the French. And even now, even the Germans are talking of sending their Taurus missiles. They have been talking of, they have given the green light to the Ukrainians to use them in Russia proper, to prevent the forward movement, to engage the forward movement of Russian troops as they come in from their concentration areas in depth to their forward assembly areas on the Russia-Ukraine border. The attacks in Crimea have been pretty high profile and rather effective. There have been drone attacks in the Russia proper, and the latest attack in Crimea, which attacked sunbathers on the Russian civilian sunbathing on the beaches of Crimea, that has incensed Russia quite a lot. Their defense ministers have spoken, and Russia has clearly warned that they hold the United States responsible for these attacks. So we are now, the whole world is watching with bated breath as to which way this whole battle in Ukraine will unfold. Will Russia now launch the long expected and perhaps overdue coup de grace? There is strong pressure amongst the Russian military to finish this once and for all. It is Putin who is being very rational, very cautious, fortunately for the world, because the Western leaders are not showing that kind of responsibility which behoves them when the conflict could so easily go nuclear. So, Russia has been working out a whole series of responses short of tactical nuclear war, and what they are trying to do is a tit-for-tat offensive. We have seen Putin go to North Korea, we've seen Putin fly to Vietnam, we have seen Putin engage in conversations with the Chinese, we have seen Russian flotilla of a guided missile frigate and a Russian nuclear submarine operating in Cuba, miles, just hundreds of miles from various city targets in the United States. And these were armed with Kinzhal hypersonic missiles which could easily engage targets in the United States with conventional weapons. So the Russian response seems to be that if you can arm Ukraine to hit targets in Russia, we can arm Iran, we can arm North Korea, we can arm a whole lot of countries inimical to the United States with such long-range conventional weapons which will enable them to strike. We are already watching this whole thing unfold in the Middle East, where the Russian threat is quite clear. They can give hypersonic cruise missiles possibly to the three H's, the Houthis, the Hezbollah, etc., and the Syrian and Iraqi Shia militias to strike at US targets in the Middle East, to strike on Israel. That could lead to another round of escalations even in the Middle East, where already the Israelis seem poised to carry out an invasion of Lebanon to attack Hezbollah in a very major way, and Iran is threatening that should that happen, they will also intervene with their arsenal of ballistic and cruise missiles. So we are watching a very dangerous game of brinkmanship unfold both in Ukraine and in the Middle East. Which way it will go is anybody's guess, but a very, very dangerous phase is now on, which could easily careen out of control by any accidental escalation into a full-blown Third World War.